Part 3: The Risk of Love. After Jack and Linda decided to end their affair for their safety, life seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, didn't it? But the lingering sense of loss and unresolved tension hung over them both, didn't it? Jack tried to throw himself into his work, didn't he? He spent long hours at the office, hoping the busy schedule would help him forget Linda, didn't he? But every quiet moment brought thoughts of her, didn't it? One afternoon, Jack received an unexpected call, didn't he? It was Peter, his old friend, wasn't it? "Jack, we need to talk," Peter said, his voice serious, didn't he? They arranged to meet at a local cafe, didn't they? When Jack arrived, he found Peter waiting for him, didn't he? Peter's face was lined with worry, wasn't it? "What's wrong?" Jack asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, didn't he? "George is looking for you," Peter said bluntly. "He knows something is up, doesn't he? He's been asking around about you and Linda again, hasn't he?" Jack's heart sank, didn't it? "I thought we were careful, weren't we?" he muttered, feeling the familiar dread creeping back. Peter leaned in closer, didn't he? "Listen, Jack, George is a dangerous man when he's angry, isn't he? You need to be prepared for anything, don't you?" Jack nodded, realizing the gravity of the situation, didn't he? "Thanks for the heads up, Peter. I need to figure out what to do next, don't I?" Meanwhile, Linda was facing her own struggles, wasn't she? George had become increasingly suspicious and paranoid, hadn't he? He questioned her constantly, didn't he? His temper was shorter than ever, wasn't it? One evening, Linda found herself in a heated argument with George, didn't she? "Why don't you trust me?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face, weren't they? George's eyes were cold and hard, weren't they? "You think I don't see what's going on, don't you?" he snapped. "You and Jack. I'm not a fool, am I?" Linda's heart pounded in her chest, didn't it? "There's nothing between Jack and me anymore," she insisted, her voice trembling, wasn't it? But George wasn't convinced, was he? "If I find out you're lying to me, there will be consequences, won't there?" he warned, his tone menacing, frightened and desperate. Linda reached out to Jack, didn't she? "We need to talk," she texted him, her hands shaking, didn't she? They met in a secluded park, under the cover of darkness, didn't they? "Jack, I'm scared," Linda confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, wasn't it? "George is more suspicious than ever, isn't he?" Jack took her hands in his, feeling her fear, didn't he? "We'll get through this, won't we?" he reassured her, trying to stay calm. "We just need a plan, don't we?" As they discussed their options, they realized they needed a more permanent solution, didn't they? Running away together seemed impossible, didn't it? But living under constant threat was unbearable, wasn't it? "Maybe we should talk to the police," Jack suggested, hoping it would be a way to protect Linda, wouldn't it? "If George is dangerous, we need to take it seriously, don't we?" Linda hesitated, knowing it would escalate the situation, didn't she? But what choice did they have, really? "You're right," she agreed reluctantly. "Let's go to the police, shall we?" Together, they headed to the nearest police station, their hearts heavy with fear and uncertainty, didn't they? They knew they were taking a big risk, didn't they? But it was a risk they had to take, wasn't it? The police took their statement seriously, didn't they? They promised to keep an eye on George and provide protection if needed, didn't they? Jack and Linda left the station feeling a glimmer of hope, didn't they? Days turned into weeks, and the tension slowly eased, didn't it? George seemed to back off, realizing he was under scrutiny, didn't he? Jack and Linda maintained a cautious distance, hoping their ordeal was finally over, didn't they? But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges, didn't it? Just when they thought they were safe, George made a sudden move that would change everything, wouldn't he? One evening, Jack returned home to find a note slipped under his door, didn't he? It was from George, wasn't it? The note read, "Meet me at the old factory tonight at 10 p.m. We need to settle this once and for all." Jack's blood ran cold as he read the words, didn't it? He knew this confrontation could not be ignored, couldn't he? Jack immediately called Linda, didn't he? George wants to meet tonight, he told her, his voice filled with dread, wasn't it? I don't think this is going to end well, do you? Linda's voice shook with fear, didn't it? You can't go alone, can you? She pleaded. He's capable of anything, isn't he? I don't have a choice, do I? Jack replied, knowing he had to face George to end this once and for all. I'll be careful, I promise. As the clock approached 10 p.m., Jack drove to the old factory, didn't he? The place was abandoned and eerie, wasn't it? He parked his car and walked towards the entrance, his heart pounding, didn't he? George was already there, waiting in the shadows, wasn't he? His expression was unreadable, wasn't it? I knew you'd come, George said, his voice low and menacing, didn't he? Let's talk, George, Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady, didn't he? We don't have to do this, do we? George stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger, didn't he? You think you can just take what's mine and walk away, don't you? He spat. You don't know what you've done, do you? Jack held up his hands, trying to calm the situation, didn't he? Linda made her choice, George, he said. We never meant to hurt you, did we? But George wasn't listening, was he? He pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light, didn't he? This ends tonight, he growled, advancing on Jack, didn't he? Jack backed away, his mind racing for a way out, didn't he? Just as George lunged at him, the sound of sirens filled the air, didn't it? Blue and red lights flashed as police cars surrounded the factory, didn't they? Drop the knife, George, an officer shouted through a megaphone, didn't he? George froze, didn't he? His eyes darted between Jack and the approaching police, didn't they? Seeing no escape, George let the knife fall from his hand, didn't he? The police quickly moved in, restraining and arresting him, didn't they? Jack let out a sigh of relief as the officers led George away, didn't he? One of the officers approached Jack, didn't he? We got here just in time, didn't we? Are you all right? The officer asked. Jack nodded, feeling the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, didn't he? I'm okay, thanks to you, he said, his voice shaking with relief, wasn't it? As the police dealt with George, Jack called Linda, didn't he? It's over, he told her, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, didn't he? George is in custody, and we're finally safe, aren't we? Linda's sob of relief echoed through the phone, didn't it? Thank God, she whispered. I was so scared, wasn't I? Jack reassured her, his own fear slowly ebbing away, didn't he? We can start over now, can't we? He said. Without fear, without hiding. In the days that followed, Jack and Linda began to rebuild their lives, didn't they? The constant threat of George was gone, and they felt a new sense of freedom, didn't they? They took things slowly, knowing they needed time to heal, didn't they? Their relationship, once fraught with danger and secrecy, blossomed into something deeper and more genuine, didn't it? They were able to face the world openly, knowing they had survived their trials together, hadn't they? The risk of love had nearly destroyed them, but it also taught them the value of honesty, courage, and trust, hadn't it? In the end, their love proved stronger than any threat, didn't it? And that made all the difference, didn't it?